Dr. Steve Rowley, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Delighted to be here, Dr. Dave. I've been looking forward to this for a long time.
Yeah, you let me know that, and that really warmed my heart to know that. And also, you let me know that you'd been a long time listener, and that you felt like it was really important to be interviewed by Shrink Wrap Radio. So,
right. Well, we've had people who I've had contact with, teachers and others who've had enormous influence on me, and also my book. I know you've interviewed Tom Elsner quite a few times, Monica Wickman, Don Kalshed, James Hollis. I mean, they've all hosted one of the endorsements for the book. So anyway, I feel like I'm honored to be and flattered to be in such company.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And so we're going to be discussing your book, The Lost Coin, a memoir of adoption and destiny. And I found it a very consuming book. I felt, sometimes reading is difficult for me these days. And so sometimes I have to kind of radically skim. But your story really pulled me in.
Oh, good, thank you.
And elements of it were close enough to my own story that I really felt like, okay, I've got to keep going. I've got to keep going here. And fortunately, I was able to do that. Now, the subtitle is about the lost coin, and I kept wondering about that throughout the book. And it was the big reveal came at the end of the book,
right?
So let's start there. Let's start with that big reveal. What does the lost coin refer to?
Yeah, let's start at the end. Well, the lost coin, in terms of the writing process, and maybe through the story of my own life, is not the conclusion, but some sort of summary judgments, if you will, about life and meaning and who am I. When I was about 3 weeks before finishing the book, I had to stop and pause and say, how am I going to finish this? And I happened to have that Zen koan on my computer and realized it was a perfect metaphor for what I wanted to say, which was that even though life has taken me many journeys, and some of them which had wrapped up nicely in certain ways, the idea of personal identity, the who am I question, remained elusive. And rather than try to put it in a box or come up with a resolution, that a Zen koan by its nature, and this one specifically, invites the idea of mystery, of non-conclusion. Those last couple words, if you don't mind, I think I'm right here in front of me, that we, hold on 1 second. Sometimes I think that after all these years, I've found myself. At other times, I think I'm less sure. I do know one thing, though. I've always been a lucky boy, but I still don't know why. I'm more content that way, not knowing. What would life be anyway without its mysteries slipping through our fingers like coins in a river, lost and found again and again? And it's that note of mystery that where I was more content holding the mystery. I think it's Campbell that said life's not a puzzle to be solved, a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. And I think now that I've written the book and I'm living with that mystery, it seems to resonate with me. And I think as I brought even people who don't know what a Zen koan is, I think people have been brought in by that particular point and feel some sort of resonance or almost an inner peace, I think, with that sense of not quite knowing.
Yeah, the koan, as I recall, I had not heard it before, but as I recall, something like, if you want to find the lost coin, look in the river where you lost it.
Right. You can say you're going to look for it where you lost it, but it's not quite looking for your keys where the last place you left them. Because when we look for an object in water, it's either muddy water, we can't find it at all, or it's refraction. It's not quite where we think it is. So that kind of that haunting "Who am I?" or at some point in the book, "What am I about?" Seems to be both the allurement, I think, for pursuing on with life, with that driven by that mystery and by that question.
When I was in graduate school, I was going through a period of depression, and so I finally decided to go to the student counseling center, and I saw a young psychiatrist. Only saw him a couple of times, but he really nailed it for me. He said, "You don't know who you are," and that for me was like a Zen koan that
Yeah.
that has stuck with me all these years, and I'm in the same place that you are. There are certain ways in which oh yeah, okay, I figured out who I am, and
Yeah.
there are other ways in which it's still a mystery, and there's still something compelling about it. So why this book now? Why did you write it?
Well, I think early in the book, I can't remember which part of the book it is now. I've cited Carl Jung talking about writing his memories, dreams, and reflections, or having someone he dictated to begin to put it together at his 83rd year, almost the same age you are. And
Yeah,
only at that time could he have the perspective to look back and tell what he calls his own personal myth, which is different than an autobiography. It's maybe even different than a memoir, but it was to trace the internal journey that he had all these years. And so somehow I had to do, I think, the complete journey of setting out to find my birth mother first after 40 years, when I was 40. And then by chance, the identity of my birth father coming to me only 2 years ago. Somehow those were the markers, always the harbingers, the clarion call that it was time to write. And so recounting that journey in a very selective way, which is part of what Memoir is about, to both track the outside life of the detective story, if you will, of what all the obstacles and other things that weren't related to adoption that were also challenges in life, but also to then begin to explore the interior life and both the unconscious and kind of that other soul's journey on the inner level. And to me, that is what distinguishes kind of the point in sharing with the broader audience is that we adoptees have very different lives on the outside. Our stories are all over the map, but the inside part, that inner journey, which I've explored in the memoir, makes us much more similar. That primal wound of separation of mother and child at a tender, critical developmental period is stuff that actually makes us much more in common. So that dive into that interior world and pulling in without being too didactic, bringing in a couple references from people like Hillman and Don Kalshed to illuminate kind of what that interior life says about who we are, and not only as a group of just adoptees, but I think probably a group of anybody who suffered any kind of trauma in the early years.
yeah. So in part, did you write the book in part for other adoptees?
I wrote it primarily for the adoption community. But then as I began to write further and talked about being, a boomer and growing up in the 50s and 60s and being in college, radical days in University of Wisconsin, having a career in education, which ended up in a gigantic car crash for my career in Silicon Valley in 2006. Those things speak to audiences that are far past the adoption world. So anybody who's been in education would appreciate kind of that journey. And basically anybody, who grew up with the Beatles in 1964, as having lived through those seminal periods of life, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Kennedy assassination, the Beatles, but Martin Luther King, assassination, Malcolm X, and so forth. We lived through all of that. It was a flurry, as you know. We're slightly different ages, but it was one hell of a time to live through.
Yeah,
and that I think is a marker for our generation. I think that hopefully I've done a decent job in selectively recounting that.
You did do a good job because I certainly recognized all those touch points, having lived through them as you did. The other thing, I know you listen to a bunch of these podcasts that I've done, but and there've been a few where I've been interviewed and talked about my own early beginnings. So, and I don't want to go into great depth about that here, but I grew up initially not knowing who my biological father was. And I had a black stepfather. And so there was this very obvious physical difference. And you talk about how as you grew up, you began to realize that you didn't look like the siblings in the family that had adopted you.
Right.
So,
by saying that, you raise the issue of cultural identity, which is another sort of robust sort of parallel to the things I've written about. Angela Tucker, who lives here in Seattle, wrote, "You should be grateful about growing up black with a white household." Just recently, in the news of Buffy St. Marie being challenged, her cultural identity being challenged because she is Native Canadian. I forget which tribe it is, but being raised by white parents and somehow being accused of not being Native, which is, if you've ever seen her, is pretty much of a joke. But those things are really important in terms of how we begin to say who we are, what tribe we belong to, what cultural, racial identity we either grew up with or choose. Sometimes in a 90-degree angle from the world at which we were brought up. So that's why I say these issues are really complex.
Yes, they are. And what you're saying, it reminds me of the issue that's kind of going on right now, is that people who are Black, have African American ancestry, some of them suffer from not being Black enough, either skin color or either culturally also. And,
I think
people really struggle with that.
Yeah. Anybody who's seen Louis Gates's show, Finding Your Roots, would really appreciate that, because if you go back just a generation or two, you find all kinds of things back there you had no idea about. One of them being Larry David, for example, who was a Jewish and a terrific comedian. Turned out they had a Confederacy slave-owning grandfather, great-grandfather. I mean, those are the surprises that lurk just not too far up back up in the family tree from where we are. And it changes radically, that idea. I think my argument is it changes by making it much more complex.
Yeah, I love that show. And I think I've mentioned it on this show. And really urge people to find it on PBS. It's a wonderful series. And he does such a great job of, as an academic, bridging into the lived lives of various people and affirming them.
He's lucky to have such a robust team of investigators, things that mere mortals would never have access to. But
Right.
you go back and obscure, rural libraries in Cuba, as an example, from 200 years ago. You've got pretty powerful means of investigation.
Yeah, it's amazing to discover how good the records were in some places, going way, way back, and
by contrast, like in my book, you can also see back when I started search for my birth mother in the pre-internet days, how primitive and difficult it is for many people.
Yeah.
Even today, I mean, I've been contacted by people, just how do I, my birth mother was adopted. She's no longer alive. I want to get a hold of her birth certificate. How do I do that? It's really still very hard in some places to get a hold of those just fundamental early records.
Yeah. Well, let's get into the adoption a bit here. You were adopted by an affluent family. And so you didn't find out the details of that until you were about how old?
Well, I began to get trickles of that information about my identity, my birth mother and birth father, probably when I was in my mid to late 20s. And then about another 10 years after that, I was eventually able to put two and two together. I got a really critical piece of information from that current director at that time of the adoption agency, who is still alive, and we've become good friends. Just enough to go back to her hometown in Iowa, just enough to go to the library with a name, find a picture in a class yearbook, and then from that I sent out short letters to people in that county with the same last name, wondering if they knew who she was or where she was. And then it took a month or two before a little short note came my way saying that this person was located back in the East Coast. And then I was on my way. That's when it felt, I think the word I used in the book is that's when the hunt was on. Then I had somebody to write to.
Yeah, you skipped us way ahead in the story. I was thinking further back, you describe how your parents were, and I think your mother in particular was very, let you know early on that you were special because you were chosen. Other kids weren't chosen in the way that you were chosen, but they chose you because they really wanted you, and they wanted you to be in their family, and they hadn't had any other children at that point. And so that was reassuring, I think, at that stage of your life. And yet there was this gnawing seed inside as you got older. Well, how is it that I look different, and where does that come from? And what kind of people would give me up? How could they give me? Was I undesirable in some way that they got rid of me? And so that was a haunting fear and concern. And then you tell of a critical incident in which your mother kind of blew up at you in your teens, I think, and it was like, oh, will you stop nagging me about that? That's just give it up. We told you we love you, damn it.
Right.
And so and unfortunately, I wasn't sure why you put this in there, but at the time she was handling a gun, and fortunately, I don't think she pointed it at you or anything.
No, she didn't handle a gun, but there was my dad being a surgeon. There were a lot of, he brought home a lot of samples of pharmaceuticals and so forth. They kept that in a cabinet, an unlocked cabinet in our kitchen, and there was a pistol up above. But no, she didn't have that. She didn't wave that in my face when she said that.
Yeah. So and so you mentioned your dad was a surgeon. I don't know if I said that this was an affluent family that you were adopted into.
Well, by Midwestern standards, it wasn't. We weren't that rich. It was just we did better than others just by virtue of his. Who knows how much money they made. The house, of course, how price of homes back then. We had the house in 1958 they bought for $33,000, and of course that was an expensive home back in those days. So it was across the street from a country club, but we were also never raised to feel privileged or to look much different. They came from very humble, both farm and small town roots, and that never really left the way we were raised. So
yeah. You did very well in school. You were very popular. You were really liked by your peers going through high school, and all sounded like it was a great time for you. You were a football hero, and you fully reveled in that and enjoyed the benefits of it. You had lots of girlfriends, and so really you were kind of a jock, I think. And
half jock, half academic. Yeah.
Yeah. And one would not have predicted that somebody who would later, be so drawn to the inner life, because you were so fully engaged, as a young person. And you tell some stories in there that I've got some stories that I've not told, I've not put out in public, and I marvel I marvel at some of the confessions in the book. For example, your confession at one point where you and your buddies had purchased 1,000 pounds of
yes, that's right,
of marijuana. Yep. Which you were looking forward to selling at a wonderful markup, and you almost, I think you didn't get caught by the cops, but you ran out of gas or something. You went into a diner, and there were a whole bunch of cops inside.
They're all sitting there in the middle of a blizzard.
Yeah. And that was just too close. You realized, well, this is way too risky. So you guys did end up selling it for, I don't think you made a lot of money on it.
No, not really.
And so I was struck that you put that story in there. And then later, at the University of Wisconsin, where you also went to school, you there was a during the 60s when there was so much protest and all.
Yeah.
I remember that period well. I was at the University of Michigan, which in some ways is a sister school to the University of Wisconsin.
Very similar, yeah.
Very similar in terms of the politics and during that period and the activism. And so somebody set off a bomb, and it turns out they were friends of yours, and you knew the kids who were the bombers.
I knew one pretty well. The other two of them, the brothers, the Armstrong brothers, I did not know, although they were well known. And the other one, Leo Burt, who even recently in the New York Times, Washington Post, is still listed as at large and has not been caught. No one really knows whether he's still alive, but I'm going to guess that he is. But yeah, he's been on the lam all these years. David Fine, who was on the lam for some time, spent a few years in prison, but he lives and works in Portland, Oregon, and got his life back. But yeah, those were all shock. That was shocking because they, at least as I say, two of them were. Leo Burt was a sports writer. He was on the crew. He seemed the most unlikely person of the bunch. And David Fine at the time was only 17. So the other two brothers were townies. Their dad worked out at the Oscar Mayer plant. These were not, New York sophisticated, weathermen. They were, but they got in really deep, and it was shocking because not only the death, but the amount of destruction was incredible. But that particular event, and it really ended, I think, across the college world, ended radical protests. Things quieted down really quickly after that. But it was quite a time to live through. With, as you probably did, we had tanks on campus, National Guard with bayonets, lots of CS gas. It was a wild time.
Yeah, you were pretty much a radical, or at least on the fringes of radical activism. And I had an experience at the University of Michigan where there was a march for the welfare mothers, protests that the welfare mothers were getting cut off or something. And so some friend and I was not one for marches, but somehow I was cajoled by a friend to join that march. And I was shocked that by deciding to join that march, by the townspeople, I was seen as a communist, as the enemy. There were guys with rifles on the roofs trained on us.
Yeah.
And that is a sobering experience, boy, to realize how fragile your political identity is and your citizenship is if you make a misstep.
Right.
Yeah. So I could.
Well, those tactics, as I say in the book, I mean, we were pushed to. You had to decide literally which side of the line you were going to be on. It was difficult, if not impossible, even socially, let alone politically, to kind of try to straddle both sides or to avoid taking a side. And those tactics go back to Saul Alinsky and the labor organization in Chicago and so forth. So I cite the fact that at some point when I really wanted to go into a class, but the picket line was there, and I ultimately had to side with staying on the outside the class because I couldn't align myself with the school administration or the war or whatever. I mean, those were the kind of, they may be arbitrary, but those times they seem quite clear, a clear cut, either you do or you don't kind of choice.
Yeah, and you had a kind of a rebellious streak where you did not easily buckle into authority and kind of resisted that, was the impression that I got.
I still do.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of a thread through the account. And I have a very good friend who I'm still in touch with for all these years. He had to drop out of our first freshman year, and because he had to marry the girl that he got pregnant. But we stayed in contact with each other, even to this very day, by phone. And so he ended up in a physiological psychology program, graduate program at the University of Pennsylvania, and were some really big wigs, and he was a star student, but he went in for his third year exams or something like that, and he refused to toe the party line. It just became obvious, and he dropped out. And he regrets that experience to this day. You know, that he kind of blew this huge career that he would have had. It was a guaranteed roadmap for him.
In my own case, I have to believe, or I choose to believe, that rebelliousness, that restlessness, that not liking rules or being confined in bureaucracies, I have to think goes back to those early days, from the day I was 10 days old until my parents adopted me 6 months later. I was in institutional care, and I think there's something viscerally inside me that makes me say that being handled, you know, even it may have been loving and caring handling, nevertheless being handled as a commodity, and having all the other rules and prescriptions and procedural things going on around me. I mean, not consciously, certainly as an infant. It just something tells me that is in part why. So now I just got through listening to listening to the audible of Charlie Chaplin's life, and although he was not adopted, but he was definitely an orphan. He was the inner tramp that he held, and he was that way to his dying day. He was a complete at odds with both the country and his own movie making world. And I just saw so much of Chaplin's life as almost a poster boy for that kind of restlessness. Or Dylan's "Like a Rolling Stone." That could be our theme song for the adoption world.
Yeah. Well, at one point, I should mention that there was this Mr. G in high school, a teacher who was very influential on your subsequent life, that really got you interested in considering becoming a teacher yourself. Right. And at one point, and I forget which institution you were at when this happened, but you had a chance to do some student teaching as a kind of internship, and they wanted you to cut your hair. And you had hippie hair at that point. And where's our hippie hair gone to anyway?
I already cut it once. I wasn't going to cut it again.
Yeah. And so you dropped out. You didn't do that. But then later on, you really are on this track. You're this career track in your life at a number of different schools, where you are definitely preparing to enter education somehow. Right. And you were influenced by Summerhill also. I read that book at the time, and it influenced me too, but did not make me want to become a teacher. or if it did, I don't remember that part of it. But it seemed like just a wonderful, idealistic, why isn't the world like this everywhere?
Right.
And
well, those roots go back, for many of us, go back, at least in this country, to John Dewey, and in Britain, the British primary movement, and the ways in which those were exported to the United States in the 50s. I mean, my Stanford influence, I had Dave Tyack as one of the people who was the great American historian of education. So I appreciate the ways in which that progressiveness morphed and changed in this country, but it led me, and coupled with my interest in schools, into the alternative school movement. I helped start one in Seattle, and later some of the different models that were coming out just kept pushing me to say something's got to be different. We have to break the mold of institutional thinking. It's probably even more true today than ever. You can see how.
Yeah. And so you gravitated finally towards school administration. I think you decided, okay, if I'm going to have any kind of real impact here, I got to get in at the top, and where I can really exert some influence. And interestingly, although you started some, quotes, hippie type schools or alternative schools, you actually felt like it was important for you had some standards and felt that
Right.
it wasn't enough just to feel good. You had to
No, absolutely not. No.
you had to study and you had to learn some stuff and demonstrate that.
Right.
So it took me a while to learn that as I tried to be a liberal professor. And I realized, wait a second, we got to have a signed reading here. We're going to have some exams.
Right.
I don't care if it is old fashioned.
Well, it's one of those difficult things for sort of those kind of, in your terminology, kind of hippie parents with their hippie kids, to say that the kind of freedom that you're looking for, the so-called freedom you're trying to grasp in light of the rules of bureaucratic schooling, require a different kind of structure and different kind of discipline. They do require a structure, but it's a different kind. And so some of creating those schools was as much of bringing parents along as it is kids. Once you have some of these structures in place, or have for example, not a feel-good curriculum, but a fairly organized and robust kind of curriculum involving across the span of the curriculum, including the arts and drama and dance and so forth, that's where you begin to see where creativity begins to flourish. That's where you find your freedom, so to speak. It's not without limits. It's within certain discipline and structures you create. That's where we learn how to, it's just like learning to write. I mean, if you just want to write, pretend you can be Jack Kerouac again or Neil Cassidy and just write on a piece of toilet paper and think that's going to be great literature. Only one person got to do that. Most of us can't do that. We have to learn those rules, those structures by which we not only learn to write well, but also connect to an audience, which is something writing a book has certainly taught me.
Yeah, and all of that, and you had a lot of training in writing. Actually, some of your teachers really they recognized that you had talent in that arena, and they demanded excellence from you, and you got plenty of papers back with lots of red marks on them. And so you did learn, and so I want to emphasize to our listeners that you've written a really good, engaging book here.
Thank you.
That's very readable because of everything that you learned about writing and all the success that you had as a writer. Now, your PhD eventually came from Stanford. This is after being at the University of Washington. You were at so many different places, but and you at University of Washington, you majored in English, which only serves to further cement your writing skills and ability and worldly knowledge through literature. And so it was at Stanford where you found some inspirational leaders, teachers who you felt like, you could model yourself after them, and so you went on.
I'm going to be on Stanford campus just in a couple of days and doing a book signing, and I know a couple of other professors I had and former classmates will be there. One of whom I think you'll know in terms of the politics of education in California is Mike Kirst, who was on the state board for 30 or 40 years and was Jerry Brown's chief educational advisor for a lot of years. And so Mike's going to come by and we'll chat it up but yeah, Mike was, I TA for him and was basically through him, I think I was fair to say I was trained as a policy analyst. And as you alluded to earlier, at some point, I just didn't see myself. I mean, I could have seen myself in terms of my academic or intellectual abilities going into a policy world, but like Mike did, but the draw to get back into the so-called real world where I became a principal in Redwood City and out of one program. I mean, that's where the rubber meets the road. When it's one thing to have policy, the other is how to create schools on the ground with real life teachers and real life kids and parents, and much more complex, much more demanding, and sometimes really rewarding and sometimes not so rewarding. But nevertheless, that's the direction I took for quite some time.
Yeah, and you spend a fair amount of the end of the book on that career trajectory and some of the challenges and the victory and the schools were never had enough money. They were
Right.
constantly running, and sometimes you were getting fired or let go of
Yeah.
for financial reasons or other
Yeah.
reasons, personality conflicts, whatever. So I think because of time here, I want us to get to your finding your parents and what you discovered about them. And there were things that you discovered that, oh, that's why I'm this way or
Right.
that way.
Right.
They were kind of like you.
Right.
So tell
Well,
us
at
about that.
age 50, after I began to tell that earlier about tracking down my birth mother, and I was told before I got there, the letter I sent her actually was intercepted by two of my half sisters and told me that she had just been released from a halfway house in a major city back east, and maybe it wasn't right for me to come see her. And I said, I'm coming one way or the other, even if I just have to stand on the other side of the street and see what she looks like. So when I did come, and the first thing she said to me when she opened the door with one of my half sisters, she peeked through the crack and said, "Who the hell gave you the right to? I didn't give you my address. What are you doing here?" And she knew I was coming, but she said that anyway, which was a little bit of a moment of take a deep
Yeah, a
breath
real
and
shock. Yeah.
hang with it. But anyway, to make it long, it's a whole chapter called Mother and Child Reunion. But I come into her apartment, and it's a pretty dreary place. It's clean, but it's dreary. But she apologized for not having her books there. Now, this is a woman who had been wandering the streets, kind of your shopping bag lady for some time, and had for years had issues with drugs and alcohol. And then she mentioned that her books were in storage, and I just sort of said, "Well, how many do you have?" And she said, "Oh, about 500 or so." And then a light bulb went off in my head, having just been recently minted from Stanford, that she was a reader. And then she actually, ironically, if you can see where my finger is in the photo, but I know your listeners won't be able to see it, is a Kandinsky. She pointed at the wall, and I said, "Oh, I see you like the National Gallery." And she said, "Oh, yeah, that's Kandinsky." And then she launched into a description, an art history lesson about Kandinsky's life and what period of Kandinsky's work this was, and so forth and so on. So that was pretty amazing, and my jaw's home. And then I told a joke about Ronald Reagan, who was running for president. She laughed so hard that in that moment, it's as though just the world split open. It was just as though I could see her, I could hear her, my laugh and hers. I could, as literally, I could just jump and read her mind. It felt it was mutual. It was like a Spock mind meld. So suddenly, all of that opened, all of the time, and I realized here we are, 40 years later, and we really do have a reunion. And a day or two later, when I left, when we held each other in our arms, I think I described it as though that we had our guardian angels, surrounding us in those last tender moments before I had to leave to come back to the Bay Area. But that was what I came for. I came to know that she remembered me on my birthday, and of course, that was a dumb question because, of course, she teared up and said, "Of course I do. I remember all the time." And my other half sisters, her daughters with another man, said, "We always knew you were out there. We just wondered when you'd come back." Now,
Wow.
contrast that until 2 years ago when I got 23andMe notification from a so-called first cousin who turned out to be the son of one of my half sisters. And within a half an hour, bing, bang, bong, suddenly I realized the information I had about my birth father corresponded exactly. So they knew he really was my birth father. They were shocked. I was shocked. And we've begun to develop a relationship over this last year or so. But he had been deceased for some time. But when they sent me his pictures, when roughly the time of the picture I had my birth mother, I realized, well, I look like him too. I mean, I'm a dead ringer for him. So ironically, one of my half sisters not too long ago, after reading the book, said, "Well, it's really clear you didn't get your brains from our dad. You got it from your birth mother." On the other hand, he was a sport letterman at a major university in the Midwest, and I have, at the time before my leg got hurt, I had a fair amount of athletic ability. So you start to see how we are in part, but not entirely, some combination of our DNA. But they each had difficult lives after I was born. Although we had four daughters and two before I was born, and then I think two after. Particularly my birth mother. This was a tortured woman, and I think that sacrifice that she made to give me to a better family, as much as I prospered and would never replace the family I have, there's always that kind of winsomeness, like, am I just romanticizing her? And of course, I don't think I was, but that's where the meeting of souls on that level does not discount the fact that I would have had a miserable life with her otherwise. So that's sort of those realizations you get along the way, and kind of a lot of these conundrums that kind of you face in terms of parentage, which I think is a good reminder to others who go through the search process. As I say in the book, be careful for what you look for. You may be looking for Elizabeth Taylor, but you're not going to find her. It's going to be
Yeah.
somebody or some other thing. So, but you
Yeah.
have to live that to really appreciate it.
Right. How old was she when she had you? Was she 19?
Oh, she was, I'm going to say roughly around 20.
Yeah. So she was quite young and had no way of supporting you. I got the impression that it wasn't easy for her to give you up, and that she felt regret about that
I
her
think
whole
so.
life.
Yes, I do. Yeah, the place that you mentioned before, the Willows Maternity Sanitarium in Kansas City, that was the hub of the adoption world in the United States at that time. And the Willows was considered the preeminent adoption or home for unwed mothers. And it hasn't physically existed since the late '60s, but it was a big operation for a long time. They advertised all over the United States, and people brought their young daughters from all the coast to come there. Ironically, my 75th birthday is coming up on February 10th, and I'm going with a fellow writer from Kansas. We are co-presenting at the Kansas City Library on the day of my 75th birthday, which is only about a mile or so from the original site. So it's strictly nostalgia on my part, but symbolically, it just seems right. It seems like this is one way to do honor to not only to her, but all the other mothers who have given up such a great sacrifice to have their children have a better life.
Yeah.
I know the audience will have quite a few people from the Kansas City adoption community there. So that's enormously pleasing me to have just that one little symbolic nod toward all that has transpired all way back when.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, the other thread that we need to pick up here is, and I knew that you had gone to Pacifica, and I kept waiting for, well, when is he going to Pacifica? And that also was way towards the end of the book.
Yeah.
That's where you got qualifications to advertise yourself as a Jungian therapist. But that thread was there from early on, that you, even when you were in high school, you had discovered Freud and some of the other earlier psychoanalytic writers, and
Yes.
you were pulled in that direction, but the environment wasn't supporting it.
Yeah. That's one of those questions I don't have an answer for. I keep thinking, well, what if I would have gone into psychotherapy at a young age instead of spending 40 years in public education? But I think back and thought, well, what would I have been as a 30-year-old therapist? I know there's plenty out there, and there's nothing, you have to be one at some point, I guess. But for me, it wasn't until my late 60s I became a therapist, and then I've already lived a pretty full life. I mean, I'm a very different kind of human being. And so I think, as you know, and appreciate, I'm lecturing the choir saying this to you, that, we, in the process of our training, we have to cook ourselves. We have to go to places, or have been the places where many of our clients, or most of them, have been, to be any kind of guide or help in any kind. So I think I bring in not only that early influence of psychotherapy, but it's interesting the ways in which my influence, say, of modern poetry, as an example, or theology and different spiritual leaders, including Zen, work their way into my practice that would never have been there before. So maybe another way of putting it is, maybe I escaped the clutches of orthodoxy that I might have experienced early on in order to enjoy what I'm enjoying today. Now, that's not to say, because you had plenty of great people who, well, I mentioned to you privately about Tom Elser. Tom was in law and had a very different life before he decided to go to Zurich and become an analyst. And we were sort of similar ages, but at the time we had a similar kind of story about breaking from one career to go into the other, where our souls demanded that we be. And it just sometimes it takes some of us a longer journey to get there.
Yeah, and you got deeply into Buddhism progressively, slowly at first, but then more and more. And you even share with us that you got to meet the Dalai Lama and Sharon Stone,
Yes,
who was also a follower of Buddhism, and so it's really quite a life. And I don't think there could have been. You can speculate, oh, what if I had discovered all of this earlier? But that's moot. This is what had to be.
Absolutely. That's the destiny part.
That's the destiny part. And by the way, we've left out the synchronicity part. You tell us about your discovery of synchronicity.
Right. Well, some buddies and I who were living out in Western Colorado had to go to Boulder to get supplies for the rest of the winter. I believe my time of the year is correct. And we booked up a hitchhiker, and he spent the night with us. And we did all the things one did back then in terms of what we smoked and drank, and so had a great time. And the next day, as we headed out, he was so grateful, and he went on to Grand Junction. Those who know Colorado is out west, and we circled back to go to Boulder. And before he left, he gave me this pouch of a suede leather pouch that had. He said, "These are Yarrow sticks. Do you know what they are?" And I said, "Not really." He said, "Well, they're for the I Ching. Have you heard of that?" I said, "I've heard of it, but not very well." So he directed me to go to the Boulder bookstore and buy Wilhelm's book on the I Ching, or Book of Changes, and I did. And I went back to the home, ironically, the former home of Robert Oppenheimer, where we were staying with some friends. So I did the first layout of the sticks, and it was 50, the cauldron, and it seemed to relate to not only to this great time I had with my friends the night before, but my own indecision or ultimate decision to come back to Seattle and go to and pursue education. But I was basically pretty lost at the time. Well, what really struck me was that because I was familiar with Jung. As you mentioned, I read him when I was earlier. He was in one of my senior theses in psychology at Wisconsin. So as I read the introduction by Carl Jung, as he describing his first time with the sticks and with the I Ching, he also got the cauldron number 50. And that sent a shiver up my spine. That was like, wow. So, and I quoted the book, his very words out of that introduction, and which was, on one hand, a formal description, as he described what synchronicity is, but living it was entirely, was exponentially more powerful. And so I mentioned the book. People use synchronicity pretty glibly in their own way, and we sometimes, I think, lose sight of, maybe we get the academic descriptor of that gets in the way of actually understanding this non-rational way of seeing the world differently. And the I Ching is just one of those powerful ways we learn to do that. But that was so instructive. And we don't have time to get into this, but the Oppenheimer piece goes back to the atomic bomb, goes back to the artifacts in my household that Dad brought back from Hiroshima, and goes forward in time to helping build a school here on Bainbridge Island named after a Japanese American family. So I have that kind of little tiny but important thread through my book about this connection to the horrors of the bomb, and somehow I'd like to think making good a little gesture toward reconciliation and unification, which I think has happened here through the Sonoji Sakai Intermediate School here. So, but yeah, those things, those amazing ways in which that matrix of the web we weave in our lives are sometimes astonishingly interwoven in ways that we could never have predicted, and yet if we examine them, they're there. I think the signs are there.
Yeah, well, I feel like my life has been very much ruled in many ways by synchronicity, and that's it's sometimes my rational side wants to take over, and I look at the synchronicity as a little wake up call, little reminder, hey, this is not the whole story,
Right. And some of the parallels I mentioned briefly, but that's the purpose of the book was not to get into it, but the interweaving of both when Hillman evolved archetypal astrology in the handoff from Jung, for example, in the Jung Institute. Also, it was already present in sometimes quite ancient writings, but this notion of archetypal astrology and the idea. This is, of course, Richard Tarnas in Cosmos and Psyche does a brilliant job of discussing this. The ways in which those alignments, they're not causal, but particularly of the outer planets, have a defining impact on our lives and societies and global life, historical events, well-known people. They don't cause them, but somehow there's a peculiar and over repeated patterns of how those archetypal alignments of the planets have some bearing and influence. Tom Moore's book on the planets within, about Ficino's work as a Renaissance poet and priest, are the precursors to all that, where we begin to see those other kinds of ways of understanding what happen, these influences in our lives that don't cause things to happen, but nevertheless they're quite present. So that's part of that. Evokes again that kind of mystery of how does all that happen?
Yeah.
Even when I had people 3 years ago, they didn't tell me I was going to be with Dr. Dave on Shrink Wrap Radio. That would have been a bridge too far. But they did say, this period of your life, this is 3 years ago, you'll be doing podcasts, writing. And I had, really? Are you kidding? I'm not going. How's that going to happen? Well, here we are. So
here we
others,
are.
Others saw it coming, and I was happy it did. It happened this way.
Yeah, me too. And so I did want to get one other thing in here. You quoted the British pediatrician Donald Winnicott as talking about the deep, nameless qualities of suffering,
right,
and childhood trauma, and you use the term primitive agonies.
Right. Well, he used that term, and I've read his work. Mark Epstein, who's a Buddhist psychiatrist, I don't know if he's been on your show or not, from New York, mentions that in the notion of Winnicott and primitive agonies. And I would relate it to in this way: a primitive agony, in my mind, again, Winnicott's the expert, not me, or Donald Colshet, not me. But there's something so profoundly deep, something so elemental, primitive within our very nature, with the darker, deeper parts of our soul, that when we have traumas of profound abuse, profound abandonment, profound being cast to, being rejected, or finding ourselves on our own, as many immigrants do, as other kids who are abandoned, that taps something that's so deep that we can't, without knowing the term or what it actually means. It's just sort of, it's a vaguely but powerfully felt psychic dynamic within ourselves, within the psyche that are constantly there, and it's not that we have to live lives as victims, and it's not like we're being overwhelmed every day, but when we get tapped in that particular way at the hands of trauma, it has that lasting, almost like he's a primitive or primordial kind of element of fear or sadness or rejection or abandonment. All of those. That's the kind of stuff we in psychotherapy deal with. It's the kind of stuff we are trained, I think, into begin to understand intuitively, more so or on a feeling level than we can rationally. But sure as could be, I'm sure any therapist who's listening or analyst would say they've found the same in difficult cases where that imprint is there. And if primitive agonies is one of the ways of expressing that, as a Kalshid would explain, that also accounts for why the splintering, why this certain parts of ourselves in childhood get splintered and stay in a sense of Kalshid would call a suspended state of animation within the psyche, until we have the means through therapy or sometimes other means to begin to release that. I mentioned that with our son, who we adopted, and I saw he was 4 years old at the time we adopted, and he had gone through a tremendous amount of trauma, of neglect and some kinds of abuse. I could see that in him, even though I hadn't had training as a therapist. I could see. I liken it to being like a miner trapped in a mine. How are we going to get that? How are we going to get that little child out? How do we get that wounded part out? Because there's a lot of defense mechanisms that want to keep those in place, and so that's the that's the challenge of a therapist, I think, is to help reduce those barriers, help lessen the degree to which either aggression on one side or depression on the other side, how we can begin to, those are the hallmarks of the two sides of the coin of dissociation. How can we begin to lessen those so we can allow that split to find a way to rejoin or to heal or to become better integrated, which does not mean eliminating memory of what happened, but it does mean not letting that fester alone and deeply within the psyche that is underlying so much of the malady we experience in our adult lives.
I'm so glad that you mentioned the adoption of your son. That's that's a major thing that we didn't get around to discussing here. But you were not looking to adopt. It was like, in a way, the furthest thing from your mind, and it circumstances kind of conspired that both you and your wife ended up feeling led to adopt this young kid who is now in college, I guess.
No, he's down. No, he's 34 years old. He lives in North Hollywood, and he's a video producer and editor. So no, he was an actor from the get-go. Went to Cal Arts, and no, that's a clear case of love at first sight. It was just, we saw him and all those other things. We still didn't want to have any kids except for him. We were so pulled in as we are today. It's just as strong today as it was back then. Just how much we loved it, how much we just instantaneous. This was somebody we wanted to raise and be a part of our lives for as long as we're alive. And that for sure is alive and true.
And this was another major synchronicity, I think. The way that came together.
Yes, it was.
So, Dr. Stephen Rowley, I want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thanks for having me. It's been just a delight, as I knew it would be, Dr. Dave. Thank you.